What are some of the pointers that you should be taking into consideration when you're switching roles?
Like, why are you looking for these changes? What are you looking for? And kind of like buying a house, like what's your must-haves? What are your nice-to-haves?
So with construction technology side of things, what kind of roles construction managers or civil engineers could probably look for?
There's a lot of different avenues. There's kind of the product side, training and industry consulting, like the sales types of roles.
Imposter syndrome. How do you kind of deal with it, especially early in your career?
It's all inside of you. Like you're overthinking it. Like you deserve to be in every room that you're in, at every table you're in, and you've got a point of view and you should share it.
What are some of the pointers that you need to consider or you need to put in your resume?
Recruiters take about 6 seconds per resume on average. Try not to make your resume over 2 pages.
When it comes to interviews, got any tips?
You're interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing you.
Welcome to another episode of Constructing Tomorrow. Today's guest is Stefanie Reichman. She is a professional engineer's licensee from the state of Nevada. She's previously worked as a VDC manager with a general contracting firm, currently working as a customer success manager with Bluebeam. She also empowers and helps people looking to career pivot. In this episode, we discuss things to consider when switching jobs or roles, how to overcome imposter syndrome, working in construction versus construction tech, roles available in construction technology, LinkedIn resume interview tips, and advice for students and young professionals. With that said, I bring you Stefanie. Hello, Stefanie. Thanks for being here and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sid. Super excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm excited for today's conversation.
Yeah. So let's just dive right into it. So you've done your education in construction and now you're working in construction technology. So walk us through your journey on what got you into construction.
Sure. I'm a civil engineer by education, but I always knew that I wanted to work out in construction. I don't know what it is about it. Maybe it was the energy or just being outside or this idea of not being trapped in an office. But there was always some kind of freedom and just excitement. I was also originally from New York City. So I think what a great playground to see these incredible buildings and bridges, infrastructure, just so many different cool projects, and the idea of working out and making that kind of change to the city skyline was just a really exciting job prospect for me. And that's kind of what drove me to wanting to work in construction.
You also have your professional engineer's license, right?
I do. I do. It was one of those things. It's actually right here. If you're watching the podcast, then you can see it on my wall. Um, it's actually one of those things that while I was in school, it seemed like the magical unicorn. That the engineers, the true engineers, they get their PE license. So I've never actually worked in engineering, but it always felt like something I had to do. So during the pandemic, I was actually scheduled to take the exam in April of 2020. So they actually canceled that exam about a month or so before the exam, which if you're studying for the PE, you know that that's kind of heartbreaking. And I ended up taking it again the following year. Still don't sign anything, don't stamp anything, don't work in engineering in that kind of capacity, but it is a really cool thing to have on my wall.
How was your construction life? I would call it two lives now because you've moved to construction technology. How was your previous life with general contracting and you've been a project manager, you've been in VDC. Walk us through some of your experiences.
Yeah, sure. So when I worked as an assistant project manager, it was for an engineering company. So it was adjacent to engineering. It was almost a cross between working as an engineer and the job that I wanted, which was to be a project manager for a construction company. So I got to try both of those things and figure out what was for me. Um, there were certainly aspects of both roles that I really enjoyed, the APM as well as the VD&C role. Um, the VD&C role really let me nerd out, maybe the best way of saying it. But it was this really cool introduction into this world of technology, which I previously knew so little about. As part of my master's, I taught a BIM course, which was really cool. And that was my first kind of introduction to Revit and Navisworks. clash coordination. So when I got the opportunity to kind of start a VDNC team, that was too good to pass up. But as part of that, it wasn't only coordination, it was also the introduction of other technologies to the general contractor. So, for example, one of the really big initiatives I led was the use of drones on job sites, which that has gained a ton of traction since, which is super exciting. They're really cool technology, and it was just a really cool experience to be part of this. Oh, I read an article about drones, and then becoming a certified drone pilot and actually flying the jobs and then presenting that information back to like owners or investors or even the project team. So being through that entire life cycle of tech was just really cool. And ultimately, that's kind of what helped me find the role that I'm currently in.
What are the applications you guys use to for drones? Was it just for like progress photos or progress updates, or did you use beyond that?
Yeah, so it was, I would say there's been a lot of advancements in even the drone software since I've kind of stepped away from that whole drone world. But what we used it for, what I specifically used it for was twofold. It was partially for marketing purposes. So any like images that went out on social media or videos, all of that. But there was also the progress photo aspect as well as like as built kind of aspects of it. So drones would get flown once a week for the majority of projects, unless there was like some big thing going on. So it was really cool because at the end of the project, we'd be able to turn over this entire product over to the owner. And they would actually be able, for example, I'm thinking of one project where they were looking for exactly where the underground utilities were placed. And so they were actually able to go through all the drone footage and because they knew pretty much the timing of when it was in the ground and they were able to pull up the exact image of exactly where it was placed. So that footage kind of became invaluable as opposed to like, here are the as-built drawings. We think they've been updated, but we're not totally confident. It's like, here's the drone footage of exactly what was placed.
Yeah, I think the progress update technology with drones or 360 cameras has definitely increased or gained traction, I would say, in the last couple of years. I want to talk to you about how did your switch from construction to a construction tech company come along?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it all starts with my son. He's two, 2.5. And after I had him, I just realized that I had to step away from general contracting. It wasn't giving me the type of life that I wanted to be the mom and the career woman that I was wanting to be. Um, was really fortunate to be able to take some time to spend at home with baby. Took about 7 months and then realized that I really missed working, which was a really important realization, I think, for me to get to. And what that also meant was I was able to be really selective and really thoughtful in terms of like what my next goal was going to be that allowed me to have that balance that I was really needing at that point in my life. Um, in my previous role, I was exposed to a lot of different pieces of technology, which meant that I was also introduced to a lot of different types of people that worked in those roles supporting those technologies. So at some point, I connected again through LinkedIn, which is a great platform and everybody should use it, with one of those account managers that I had previously connected with. And through connections, you know how these things tend to happen, they actually ended up connecting me with someone who's currently my coworker. And I had kind of the imposter syndrome of why would a software company want somebody like me? And the company was thrilled that somebody like me wanted to work for them. So it was a bit of a mismatch in a sense of our thoughts and feelings, but it ended up all working out. And I work at Bluebeam, the PDF software solution, and I've been here almost for 2 years now. So, and the role was able to give me that balance that I was really looking for. So it's been a great time.
Great story, and I think you touched upon a couple of great points. First was striking a balance with what the situation is and what your expectations are from a role, right? So I wanted to know when someone is trying to do a career pivot or just even within the industry, like a role pivot. Say you did pivot from like a project management role to a BIM VDC role. So I was wondering what are some of the pointers that you should be taking into consideration when you're switching roles?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I think for me, at the times of each one of my pivots, they felt really normal to me. Like this was the next step of what I should be doing. In hindsight, they weren't so normal. And I was very often faced with questions like, why isn't this role enough for me? And why am I looking for something else? And what is that something else? And I think the biggest thing that I would encourage anyone who might be in that position who's not really sure of what their next role is to really do that introspective work to figure out like, why are you looking for these changes? What are you looking for? And kind of like buying a house, like what's your must haves? What are your nice to haves? Because that does make a really big difference when you're kind of thinking of what's important to you, whether that's salary or title or just general work flexibility, career longevity. There's so many different pieces to it. Um, and to take that introspection and just let that guide you as opposed to, I know I get a lot of people that message me on LinkedIn, sometimes really heartbreaking things and something like, I spent all these years as a civil engineer. I feel like I'm throwing my life away if I go work in something else, but I know I'll be happier there. And that's really difficult. Like don't let that fear stop you if you really feel inside that that is the next step for your career.
And in terms of finding your interest within a role, do you feel like is there like a timeline one should try out that role for, say, at least 3 months or 4 months to just give yourself time to understand what are aspects or what are expectations belong to this role before you kind of think about switching? Do you feel there's a timeline to it?
Yeah, I don't feel like there's a specific timeline. I think it's really hard and it's very personal. It's one of the reasons why sometimes people ask me, a specific question. It's really hard to just immediately jump in and answer because, for example, I worked as an APM for, I think when I left, I had been there for about 10 months. And I remember at the time, my mom said, you should really stay at a job for a year. And that was really hard. I made a very conscious decision to say, no, I'm not going to stay here for a year because this isn't what I want to do. And I got this incredible opportunity and I'm not going to pass it up. And I think a lot of people are worried, well, does that mean you're a job hopper or things like that? And I think it's important to realize that your happiness is the most important thing. And so if your happiness is at stake and your mental health and everything else that comes with it is at stake because you're doing something in an environment you're not happy with, in a role you're not happy with, then there is no prescribed amount of time you should stay in that role if it's not serving you. And that's really important. And I wish I had heard more of that earlier in my career, that there isn't a perfect amount of time to stay in a role. If you're not happy, then find something that will make you happy. Take the time to find it because you just owe it to yourself.
Yeah, I completely resonate with that, and I think I've heard a quote that you should be really passionate about what you're doing because every morning you wake up, and if you're not passionate about what you're gonna achieve during the day, you should probably consider switching your position because you don't just love enough of it to do it every day. So great point. So with construction technology side of things, what kind of roles construction managers or civil engineers could probably look for?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think there's so many different roles that you could really do, really depending on the type of avenue that you might be interested in. Um, I'll make a shameless plug here. This was the hardest question for me to answer. I knew I wanted to try working in tech, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. And that was quite the journey to figuring that out. I had a lot of people help me on that journey, and I did a lot of research. But what I ended up doing, because I do get this question asked a fair amount, is I actually wrote a how-to career pivot guide. There's a whole chapter dedicated to how to answer this question. But the short answer is there's a lot of different avenues. There's kind of the product side, so actually helping develop the product. There's also entire teams dedicated to training and industry consulting. So you'll actually work on kind of bringing the software, whatever the item is, probably software, to a specific company, working with them on their enablement. Then there's more of like the sales types of roles. I work as a customer success manager, so that's pseudo sales, kind of working with customers on their workflows. So there's a lot of different avenues depending on kind of your interest level. At this point, through like posting on LinkedIn, I've probably met people who have done a little bit of all of those different things. So I don't think there's like one, one path. If you're a civil engineer, like all these things are open to you. It's just a matter of like what you feel most interested in or called to do.
You also mentioned about imposter syndrome, and this I think this applies to everything in general and not just career pivot or changing roles. My question was, how do you kind of deal with it, especially early in your career? You feel like, oh, I'm not able to understand everything, I'm not able to deliver it, or I feel like I just don't have enough experience. How do I speak with seniors? Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is realizing that it's all inside of you. Like you're overthinking it and you're afraid of things that you probably shouldn't be afraid of. Like you deserve to be in every room that you're in, at every table you're in, and you've got a point of view and you should share it. um, I think when you realize that nobody wins when you keep things to yourself, that kind of starts opening the doors for you to keep speaking up, because your voice matters, no matter the amount of experience you have. The reason I say that is because while maybe you don't have as much industry experience, you have a different type of experience and a different point of view. And I think those are all really important to share.
Great points. With changing industries is just changing roles. I wanted to talk to you about the tools that you had and the means and methods that you did to crack a tech interview. So, firstly, I wanted to talk about LinkedIn and how has LinkedIn helped you either to make connections, find leads, or find interviews. Just if you can provide a couple of tips.
Yeah, sure. So I totally underutilized LinkedIn. I'll start off by saying that, especially earlier in my career, I thought it was just like a job searching platform that you just update when you're ready to start looking for a job. And I think most of us think about it that way. Um, I think there's so much more to it. I'll say that my previous two roles I got exclusively because of LinkedIn, connecting with people, talking with people. I think the biggest tip here is to keep growing that network. And I know that's really overused right now in terms of like, what does that mean? What does networking on LinkedIn mean? I think it's really about just getting in there, interacting with them, sending them messages, connecting with folks who are also civil engineers, or they're doing something that maybe you're interested in doing. So it's maybe you're listening to this and you're thinking, gosh, product sounds like a really cool role. Go find some people that are working in construction tech as product managers and ask them about their experience. I think a lot of people send like two messages, they don't get a response, and then they get super turned off from LinkedIn, and they're like, "Oh, she was lying," and I think that's important to recognize that like most of us don't get a super high percentage of responses. People aren't on LinkedIn all the time, so don't let that discourage you. So I guess those are a bunch of different LinkedIn tips there.
Yeah, I think I personally am a big advocate of using LinkedIn to its maximum potential when it comes to both finding jobs and networking. I always tell students to create a LinkedIn profile and start networking from the beginning and not 2 months before you're trying to find a job, because at that time it's just, I feel it's too late to network and find a job. So always have a LinkedIn profile. Some of the tips that I would like to share is, always optimize your LinkedIn profile, basic stuff. Have a good headshot as your profile picture. Write all your experiences, put your proper bio, have everything. Maybe you can put your resume if you're actively looking for a job in a featured section. There is actually a pretty cool feature if you get premium under the job section. It would allow you to, it basically shows you some templates, behavioral type questions that are frequently asked during the interviews. So maybe you can use those templates to draft your own answers. So that's a pretty cool feature. And I would say with networking, as you mentioned, you may not get enough responses. I always think of it as like a numbers game. Maybe you send out requests to 100 people, 70 might accept the request, and probably you might reach out, like you might text 50 people and maybe 10 of them reply to you. But when you're looking for a job, you would just need that one reply or one text message to get that interview or a lead. So I personally feel that networking is a great tool to kind of crack interviews or get jobs. Talking about resumes, um, is there a difference between when you're probably trying to do a job role change or industry change? What are some of the pointers that you need to consider or you need to put in your resume?
So a couple of interesting things about resumes, kind of right off the bat. I think it's really important to realize that recruiters take about 6 seconds per resume on average reviewing your resume. So it's super important to make sure that the resume comes across the way you want to come across as fast as possible. I always like to kind of explain to somebody, if you're sending me your resume, for example, I need to know what you're about in 6 seconds. And if you feel really confident that like a stranger can figure you out in 6 seconds, you're good to go. But for the most part, a lot of resumes do need some help. They almost feel like an afterthought sometimes, and they're really important. So please take your time on them. A couple of quick tips. Um, Try not to make your resume over 2 pages, especially if you've got less than, I would say, about 7-ish years. Your resume should be 1 page. You might ask, how do I do that? It's a lot in the formatting and a lot in making sure that you're being really intentional in terms of the words that you're using and just generally the type of information that's on your resume. So just a lot of intentionality. It takes a lot of time, but it's worth it, especially if you want to make sure that you're kind of coming across, like I said, the way you want to be coming across. Besides that, I feel like I can keep rattling off a bunch more resume tips. But the one I will probably wrap up with is um, get your resumes reviewed. Send them to a friend, send them to your mom, send them to whoever, an old teacher, and ask them for their feedback. Now, with resume feedback, it's kind of like everyone's got an opinion and a lot of them will be conflicting. So take what feels right to you. Ultimately, it's your document that represents you. Um, but get feedback from people so that you make sure that really what's coming across is right.
Yeah, I really like the feedback point. I think I probably keep changing my resume for over 6 months. I was just kind of refining each and everything as I was talking with seniors, I was talking with any industry professionals as they're reviewing or providing comments. One other tip that I would like to add is, do not make your resume wordy. Like you can convey the same point in less words. And then also, I don't know if companies nowadays use the ATS system where it kind of, the computer reads your resume and matches keywords and whatnot. So I think I would suggest also mentioning the keywords that you see in the job description. So other thing that you need to do is proofread your resume. again and again. When it comes to interviews, got any tips, Stephanie?
Sure. Interviews, I think, are really interesting. So, obviously, once you get to that interview stage, first of all, take a moment to congratulate yourself because I think we never really stop to do that sometimes. The biggest thing for me with interviews and a mindset shift that really helps me is you're interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing you. And I think when you take that approach, the conversation becomes very, very different because suddenly there's certain things that you want to know because I don't want to work for a company whose maybe their mission doesn't align with mine, their values don't align with mine. That's really important. And if I'm thinking about it in that perspective, that's really different than saying, gosh, I'm just really desperate for this job. And I know that sometimes that is the situation and you are really desperate for the job. So I think it's really striking that balance, but also remembering and keeping top of mind that you're interviewing them just the same way. You can walk away from the interview process just the same as the employer can. Besides that, another interview tip that's been really helpful to me is just having a couple of questions that um, kind of relating to the earlier point, a couple of questions that are important to me. And it's not so much about the answers to them, but how they're being answered. Because I think a lot of the interview, you obviously have the technical chops. Otherwise, you wouldn't be at the interview. It's really more of the personality and will they fit within the group or the company. And so I think it's important for the other way around too. Like, will my personality match within this organization? For example, I don't like very crude jokes. So is this the type of company that will make these types of jokes and I will be turned off and I won't enjoy working there? And so I'd want to ask certain questions to see how they respond. I don't necessarily care about what the response is, but more like how it's being responded to in general. Um, and so I think that really the interviews become a bit of an art form at this point, but I think keeping those different things in mind is definitely really, really helpful.
Yeah, and I think with especially with construction operations interview, they aren't really technical. So I think what really has worked for me is for each and every line item that I write in my experience section in the resume, I have a story for it. So when I'm talking with the hiring manager or the team, I usually tell a story about it rather than just stating what I have in the resume because they can you have the line item in your resume, they can read it, but if you share like a story about it, they are more likely to ask more question, and I feel like you are more in control of the conversation at that point. As you mentioned, it's just about you interviewing them as well and not just them interviewing you. So great insights on that.
I have another point actually. In addition, I think something else I wish that people kind of chat a little bit more about regarding interviews and maybe a little bit on the resume too. I think there's a really sort of like picture of what professionalism looks like. And I think oftentimes people assume that like your personal life is kind of outside of the professional life. So I certainly also kind of encourage if it feels right on the resume or during an interview, like there's no reason why you can't also share aspects of your own life within the interview. It makes you more of a human. For example, this is a very embarrassing story to share, but when I interviewed at my current job, I was actually driving from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Wisconsin, which is about a 5 hour drive. I had my almost, I think he was 7, 8 months old at the time, screaming in the back seat. Um, I thought he would be napping when I took the call, and it felt super stressful at the time, and I really thought I had lost out on the opportunity. In hindsight, like it's just me being human, and the recruiter said that many times. But it happens, and that's kind of like the stage of life that I'm in. Is I do have this toddler. Sometimes he does a little bit of screaming. So I think it's important to kind of lean into that as well, and to kind of like share the stories or your hobbies. it gives that kind of human interaction. So it's not like, oh, we're going to hire, Stefanie. She's a little bit of a robot, but she knows what's going on. Kind of feel comfortable and empowered to share your feelings and your kind of what you're working on and your personal kind of hobbies.
Yeah, I kind of resonate with it. I remember a story similar to you back at Purdue when I don't remember which company, but um, this was during career fairs when I was talking with them. I think the previous day I went to ice skating, and I fell so many times. It was my first time ice skating, so I fell so many times that it was funny at that point. And during my like how you do like a short talk before you kind of talk with the recruiter or the hiring manager that comes in, I shared that story, and we actually ended up talking like 5 minutes on just ice skating. So it will surprise you how just doing this small things helps you break the ice and kind of steer the conversation in a very good direction. I usually like to end the conversation with a couple of tips that you would like to give to young professionals or students who are just entering the industries.
Sure. I feel like there's been a bunch of tips throughout this whole conversation. I think the biggest thing I wish that I had heard more of when I was in school and early in my career is that it's okay to explore different things and to pivot. I know that's a lot of what I talk about today and what I talk about on LinkedIn as well. But it's a mission I feel really strongly about. When I was in school as a civil engineer, it felt like I had only two options. I could either be a design engineer or I could work construction. There was no other option. And so I think when you kind of get to that point in your career where you're like, well, I tried this and I tried that and neither worked. What do I do? Did I waste all this time? I think having someone or just being told like it's okay to try something new, to learn something new, to lean into it, I think is a really important piece of advice that I really wish more people knew. So that's a piece of advice that I feel really strongly about. And the other one, especially for any woman that's listening to this, but the men as well, you should always feel comfortable in advocating for yourself. Whether that means advocating for a certain situation that you felt wasn't handled properly, or negotiating for your salary. You should always feel comfortable to speak up for yourself. There isn't a set amount of time, after 5 years in the industry, you get a gold star and suddenly you can advocate for yourself. That starts day one. And there's lots of resources out there for how to do that. I don't know that there's a perfect way, but I think the important thing to realize is that you should do it and you should feel empowered to do it.
Stephanie, if anyone wants to reach out to you, what's the best way?
Yeah, sure. Best way to reach out is through LinkedIn. You can always hop in my DMs, chat, tell me what's going on. I have that career pivot guide that has helped a lot of people at this point. I don't know when this is coming out, but I did actually just hit over 100 people that have worked with me in some capacity. So a super big win for career pivots everywhere. But yeah, in that guide, there's actually a bunch of resume tips and LinkedIn tips and interview tips. So there's a lot in there. I think when people purchase it, the biggest thing they say is, wow, that's a lot, which is exactly the takeaway I want them to have. But yeah, if you have any questions, career pivots, civil engineers, don't know what's next, resume tips, you can always DM me, Stefanie Reichman, on LinkedIn.
Sounds good. I'll also drop down the links to what Stephanie mentioned in the description. Stephanie, it's been great catching up with you. Thanks so much for doing this.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Sid. Super excited by what you're doing with this podcast too. So I'm excited to keep watching future episodes and excited to see the impact you're making on the industry. So thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Constructing Tomorrow. I hope this episode provided valuable insights and tips. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and drop a review or a comment. Until next time, keep building and stay curious.